In the last few days, something in my house has started to bother me in a quiet, almost invisible way, but impossible to ignore. It wasn't a shout, a fight, or a sudden change in behavior. Nothing like that. It was much more subtle, and precisely because it was subtle, it was more disturbing. I began to notice that my wife, normally so organized with her schedule, so firm in her routines, so predictable in her little nightly rituals, started to disappear at the same time every day. It wasn't as, if she announced she was going out, or as if she had a ready excuse. She would just get up, sometimes in the middle of a conversation, sometimes in the middle of silence, and simply say, "I'll be right back," and she would go downstairs towards the garage. On the first night, I thought it was normal. Maybe she went to get something from the car, maybe she forgot a shopping bag, maybe she was looking for something in the toolbox. I didn't think much of it. But on the second night, and the third, and the fourth, the repetition started to create a strange feeling. Each new night, I realized that this quick trip always lasted the same amount of time. A few minutes, never more than 10. But those minutes were filled with something I couldn't yet identify. Until one night, I did something I perhaps shouldn't have done. I stopped looking at my phone, discreetly got up, and slowly walked to the top of the stairs leading to the garage. I didn't go down, not yet. I just stood there observing in the dark, in absolute silence. And it was there, standing between doubt and fear, that I heard something that froze my chest, the muffled sound of her crying echoing through the garage. My wife was crying, alone, again. It wasn't a desperate cry, one of those loud, sobbing sobs. It was a restrained, painful cry, as if she were trying to hold back the sadness in her throat so that no one, especially me, would notice. It was the kind of cry of someone fighting against something inside, something old, something deep. And there, in that moment, for the first time, I felt a sensation I couldn't name, a mixture of worry, fear, and guilt. Guilt for not being there with her, guilt for not knowing what she was going through, guilt for all the details I might have ignored in recent months. The next day, I tried to bring it up, but she avoided it. She responded with that tired smile that only someone who is suffering learns to use as a shield. She said it was nonsense, that everything was fine, that it was all in her head. But I already knew it wasn't. Something was breaking inside her, and I could feel it as if I could hear the cracks spreading. And as happens in many marriages, a small distance began to form. Not a physical distance. She continued sleeping next to me, having coffee with me, in the same rooms, in the same house, but an emotional distance, almost imperceptible at first, but growing slowly, like a crack in the glass that suddenly cuts through everything. This distance settled between us without asking permission, without explanation, and I found myself lost, trying to understand what was happening. This is where the audience starts to connect, because almost everyone has experienced a situation where the person they love keeps something to themselves and doesn't share it. It's a kind of silence that hurts. It's the feeling that there's a whole world hidden behind the eyes of someone you believe you know completely. And when you realize you don't, fear arises. Fear of what's behind the silence. Fear of what might be revealed. Fear of what might happen if you insist too much. That night, something changed inside me. It was as if a light had turned on, not in the environment, but in my consciousness. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't stress. It wasn't just passing sadness. There was a reason. There was a story there, hidden beneath layers of pain and secrets she was trying to protect. And the question that lingered in my mind, vibrating within me, was the same one that will remain in the mind of anyone watching the video. Why was my wife crying every night in the garage? That question became the starting point for everything that came after, for all the revelations, all the confrontations, all the truth that was about to emerge from a place where no one ever thought to look. After that night, when I heard my wife crying in the garage, something inside me became restless, as if an invisible door had opened, and I couldn't close it anymore. I knew something was wrong, but trying to understand what it was felt like trying to see through a foggy window. You know there's something there, but you can't make out its shape. And that uncertainty, is one of the most distressing things that exist within a relationship. The next morning, I decided I needed to talk to her, not in an invasive way, not pressuring her, but trying to create space so she felt safe to speak. I made coffee, arranged everything the way she likes it, waited for her to wake up and come down to the kitchen. When she appeared, with that almost automatic smile, I immediately realized that she knew how to hide her emotions like few people can. There was something in the way she avoided my gaze that told me more than any words could. I asked carefully, "Are you okay? Last night I noticed you went down to the garage again." She paused for a moment, no more than 2 seconds, but long enough to reveal that the question had touched a nerve. Then she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and replied, "Oh, it's all in my head. Messed up sleep, silly worry. It's nothing serious." But it was. I knew it was. I tried to insist a little, saying that I wanted to understand, that I wanted to help, that I was there for her. But she changed the subject with an almost rehearsed skill, as if she had practiced that movement her whole life. She talked about work, about a message she needed to reply to, about the possibility of rain at the end of the week. Anything served to avoid the topic. And it was there that an unsettling feeling settled in, that she was hiding something, not just from me, but from herself as well. Throughout the day, this feeling only grew stronger. She seemed tired, distracted, like someone who is present, but not really there. At times, she would pick up her phone and stare at it without touching it, as if waiting for something that never arrived. At other times, she would wander aimlessly around the house, as if trying to occupy her mind to avoid thinking about something that kept coming back. I tried talking to her again that night. Nothing aggressive, just a sincere attempt to reconnect. "Honey, if something's wrong, you can tell me. You don't have to carry this burden alone," she simply replied in a low voice. "I know, but I don't know how to explain it." And that phrase hurt more than any clear denial, because when someone says they don't know how to explain it, it usually means they're facing something that hurts too much to put into words. The atmosphere at home began to change. It wasn't an immediate change. It wasn't an explosive conflict. It was that slow change that settles in like a fog, making everything heavier, quieter, more distant. We talked less. We laughed less. And without realizing it, we began to avoid certain topics, certain times, certain glances. The feeling of closeness began to be replaced by a kind of exaggerated caution, as if we were both walking on broken glass. And for the audience, this is a point of strong identification, because many people have already felt this strangeness at home, that atmosphere where it seems like something is wrong, but nobody says anything. Everyone has gone through moments when the person you love is clearly suffering, but insists that everything is fine. And this type of situation creates a silent wound, a tension that grows without fanfare, like a rope stretched to its limit, about to snap. There were nights when I'd find her sitting on the sofa, staring into space. Other times, she'd lock herself in her room and say she just wanted a moment alone. And the further she distanced herself, the more I tried to understand. But every attempt turned into a wall, a cold wall, built with short phrases, empty smiles, and that same excuse that was becoming a mantra. "It's all in my head." But it wasn't all in her head. Something was happening, something that came before me, something that perhaps even she didn't know how to deal with. And every time she avoided talking, every time she looked away, every time she changed the subject as if fleeing a fire, my heart ached. I started to feel afraid. Yes, afraid. Not just of what might be happening to her, but of what it could mean for us. Afraid of losing someone without knowing why. Afraid that she was facing a problem I didn't know how to solve. Afraid that what she was hiding was too big, too painful, too dangerous. And while all these thoughts consumed me, the question I couldn't get out of my head was simple and devastating. What was my wife trying to hide from me? And even more distressing, why did she prefer to face this alone? That feeling of loving someone who is clearly struggling with something but won't let you in is one of the loneliest experiences one can have in a marriage. And it was precisely at that point that I realized what lay ahead wouldn't just be difficult. It would be transformative. With each vague answer, each averted glance, and each flimsy excuse my wife gave me, something inside me began to grow. A silent fear, almost imperceptible at first, but which, as the days passed, transformed into a constant presence in my mind. It was as if a dark thought sat in a corner of my chest, waiting for the right moment to spread. And little by little, it did spread. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. I told myself I was exaggerating, that everyone has bad days, that maybe it was just work stress, anxiety, accumulated fatigue. But as the nights went by and she continued to go to the garage to cry in secret, these excuses began to seem too flimsy. It was like trying to plug a huge hole with a piece of tape. It didn't hold it together. It didn't explain. It didn't calm her down. And when the mind craves answers, it begins to create its own theories, and none of them are usually easy to follow. The first clue that struck me was that she might be ill, an illness that people try to hide out of fear, shame, or not wanting to worry their family. I started noticing small gestures, the tiredness in her eyes, the paleness I sometimes thought I saw, the way she held her hands as if she were constantly cold. Suddenly, everything seemed like a sign, and that's when fear first took shape. I thought about tests, diagnoses, unexpected news. I thought maybe she had received some results without telling me. Maybe she was trying to process everything alone before getting involved. Maybe she was afraid of hurting me. That idea tormented me, the possibility that she was suffering physically while trying to protect me and not herself. But, as always happens, when the mind opens one door, it soon opens a second. The second hypothesis was less dramatic in a physical sense, but equally frightening. Financial problems. Perhaps she had taken out a loan without telling me. Perhaps she had gotten into debt trying to help a family member. Perhaps she was, desperate, trying to resolve something that had spiraled out of control. And the more I thought about it, the more details began to seem suspicious. A bill that arrived and that she quickly put away. A call she answered in a low voice. A document she folded and placed at the bottom of a drawer. And of course, when it comes to money, the emotional weight is immense. Financial problems silently corrode marriages, leave proud people destroyed inside, and cause someone to hide the pain because they think admitting it is a failure. And I knew my wife was always proud when it came to responsibility. It was easy to imagine that she might try to resolve an entire crisis without telling me. But none of these hypotheses, however harsh they were, hit me as hard as the third. The third one began as a whisper, one of those you immediately try to banish from your head, a thought you reject, argue against, try to kill before it grows. But thoughts like that don't die easily. They cling to fear, feed on insecurity. And my fear at that time was enormous. The third hypothesis was that the problem was related to us, to the marriage, to the relationship we've built over so many years. And that's when the silent fear stopped being a distant ghost and became a monster sitting right beside me. I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me, if I had failed at something, if she was unhappy and didn't know how to say it, if there was some hidden resentment, some old hurt, some memory she had never overcome. And of course, the question no one wants to ask, but that always comes up. What if there was someone else? This question is like a knife that touches the chest without piercing but threatens every second. It's a doubt that no one wants to feel, but that arises when the silence between two people begins to echo louder than words. I began to analyze her every behavior with the eyes of an emotional detective, the time she spent on her cell phone, the way she sometimes seemed lost, the difficulty she had looking me in the eye when I tried to have deeper conversations, the way she suddenly seemed to be living in two worlds, the world where she told me everything was fine, and the world where she cried secretly in the garage every night. And this internal conflict began to consume me, because at the same time that I was afraid of the answer, I also desperately wanted to know the truth, any truth, even if it was painful. The unknown for me was becoming more destructive than the worst-case scenario, and it is precisely here that the audience emotionally engages with the story. because everyone has experienced this kind of mental torture. Everyone has lived through that moment when their mind creates terrible scenarios due to a lack of information. It's the feeling of losing control of one's own life, of trying to protect the person you love while fearing that they might be drifting away, of imagining 1,000 things and none of them bringing peace. And her silence, night after night, only fueled that fear. I was sleeping worse. I woke up worried. I spent the day thinking about what might be happening. And more, I felt that something huge was about to happen, something that would change everything, something that perhaps I wasn't ready to face. The silent fear grew so much that it became a shadow, and when I realized it, the shadow was already following my every step. I just never imagined that the truth was hidden in a place I would never have guessed. And what I would discover would have nothing to do with illness, debt, or betrayal, but it would be much, much deeper. After days of living amidst assumptions, silent fears, and questions that never had answers, I reached my breaking point. There comes a point when the mind tires of creating theories, and the heart demands real answers. It was on a particularly silent night, the kind of silence that seems even greater than the house itself, that I made a decision that would change everything. I would go after her, not to confront her nor to pressure her, but to finally understand what was tearing apart the woman I loved. She got up from the room as she always did. She simply said, "I'll be right back," and she walked toward the door that led to the garage stairs. I watched her disappear into the shadows of the hallway, heard the faint echo of her footsteps descending step by step, and then the soft click of the garage door closing behind her. That sound, that night, seemed louder, more definitive, as if it were a sign that I could no longer postpone the truth. I waited for a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the kind of waiting that fills your chest with tension, that makes your heart beat faster, even without any concrete reason. I walked carefully to the edge of the stairs, almost feeling like an intruder in my own home. The light was off, and shadows gathered in the corners, creating a dimly lit corridor that seemed to reflect exactly what I was experiencing inside. I descended slowly. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should. The air grew colder as I approached the lower floor, a physical cold, but also an emotional one, as if I were entering unknown territory. When I reached the door separating the hallway from the garage, I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and touched the doorknob. The metallic, icy sensation of that touch sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I pushed the door open slowly. The garage was completely silent. The dim light, coming from an old lamp in the corner, cast long shadows on the cement floor. The atmosphere seemed frozen in time. But what caught my attention most wasn't the shadows, nor the coldness of the environment. It was the smell, a light, sweet, familiar perfume. Her perfume. It was as if she had just been there, as if she had been in that exact spot where I was standing now, as if, for some reason, she had been exactly where her pain resided and had fled upon, hearing my footsteps or realizing I was following her. I looked around, trying to locate any trace of her, any movement that would indicate where she was, but everything was still. The parked car, the stacked boxes, the tools on the wall, everything the same, everything ordinary, and at the same time everything laden with a strange tension. The only living thing in that room was the perfume. That perfume seemed suspended in the air like an uncomfortable memory, as if to say, "Yes, she was here." "Yes," she cried, "but you arrived too late." This detail is crucial in the video because it creates a cinematic sensation of presence and absence at the same time. The audience can feel this emptiness, this almost painful silence. It's the kind of scene that grabs attention and emotionally moves the viewer. I walked slowly through the garage, trying to understand what she did there every night. With each step, the feeling that I was stepping on a secret grew inside me. The cold floor seemed to amplify my thoughts. The smell of oil, wood, and her perfume created such a strong contrast that it was almost uncomfortable. It was as if I were entering a world that existed inside our house, but to which I never had access. a world she kept only for herself. I walked past the car, looked between the boxes, and approached the workbench. Something was out of place. A plastic chair slightly turned to the corner, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Underneath it, a crumpled handkerchief. My heart tightened in a way I can't describe. That handkerchief wasn't there that morning. She had cried there, sitting in that chair, alone, in the dark. And it was precisely at that moment that the emotional camera, the one that exists in the mind of the person experiencing the scene, began to record everything. The cold atmosphere that seemed to welcome no one. The shadows that stretched across the walls, creating a feeling that the place was trapped in an eternal twilight. The emotions suspended in the air, as if they still vibrated, as if they still echoed her suffering. I was there, in the middle of the garage, completely alone, surrounded by silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that screamed, that warned, that said there was something deep, serious, perhaps too old to be easily explained. I felt the weight of that revelation without even having discovered the truth. It was as if the entire environment was trying to tell me something, but with fragmented, incomplete, painful clues. It was there, in that combination of cold, silence, and perfume, that I understood it was no longer possible to ignore it, that the situation had gone beyond the limit of, it's okay, that my wife was facing something big, too big to face alone. And the garage held more than just old boxes and tools. It held a story. She harbored a pain. I held the key to a mystery that I still didn't know how to decipher. And without realizing it, that night marked the beginning of my search for the truth. A search that would lead me to the letter hidden under the shelf, to the revelation that would change everything, to the answer for every tear she shed in the dark. As I slowly walked through the silent space of the garage, trying to piece together loose clues that made no sense, I had the feeling that I wasn't just entering a physical place. I was entering a forgotten emotional territory, a corner of the house that, until then, had held no meaning, but now seemed to carry an almost sacred weight. I had already noticed her scarf, still damp, and the chair turned towards the corner as if it were a small refuge within that cold environment. The scent of her perfume was still in the air, soft, unsettling, fresh. Everything indicated that she had been there just minutes before I arrived, and just when I tried to understand why she had left so quickly, something unexpected happened. A faint sound echoed from the back of the garage. It was so subtle that, for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, perhaps influenced by the tension already building up in my body. But seconds later, the sound repeated itself. A small crack, as if something had lightly tapped on wood. It wasn't loud enough to frighten me, but it was constant enough to intrigue me. And in that situation, every detail took on an air of mystery. My heart raced. The sound came from the darkest corner of the garage, right behind the shelves full of boxes, old tools and objects we kept only out of habit. That corner had always been the most neglected in the house. Nobody touched it. Nobody was interested. It was the kind of place that becomes a repository for forgotten memories, for things that are no longer useful, but that nobody dares to throw away. A corner of dust, silence, and the past. The sound repeated itself once more, a gentle touch, as if something were swaying beneath the wood, as if an object were about to fall, or as if someone had placed something there and hadn't secured it properly. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to go over there. Each step seemed calculated, heavy, as if I were delving deeper into a secret that didn't belong to me. As I approached the bookshelf, the atmosphere seemed to grow even colder. Perhaps it was just my imagination. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, but the feeling was real. A shiver ran down my neck, as if some truth was hidden behind that piece of furniture and knew I was about to find it. The ceiling light flickered slightly, creating shadows that trembled on the wall as if they had a life of their own. The scene had something cinematic about it, almost supernatural, but at the same time extremely human, because most of the fear I felt didn't come from the environment, but from what I might discover there. I approached slowly, moving boxes aside and pushing the shelf a few inches to the side. The noise ceased, as if it had sensed my presence. For a few seconds, silence returned to dominate everything. A silence so dense that I could hear my own breathing. I hesitated, trying to decide whether I should continue or simply go back inside, pretend nothing had happened, and hope she would be honest with me. But that was no longer an option. I leaned forward a little more, bent down to look under the bottom shelf of the bookcase, and that's when my eyes caught something. A piece of paper, a piece of yellowed paper, tucked under the wood with its folded corner, as if it had been placed there on purpose, hidden in a spot where no one would easily notice. But there it was, motionless, forgotten, silent, and at the same time carrying an energy that seemed to pull my eyes like a magnet. I felt my stomach churn. It wasn't just any piece of paper. The color already betrayed its age. It was old, very old. It seemed almost fragile, so thin, as if it had been there for years, decades perhaps. But at the same time it seemed out of place, almost out of context, as if it had been placed recently in that exact spot to be found, or to remain hidden. I reached out, but hesitated before touching it. My finger stopped just inches from the aged surface, because at that moment the realization hit me like a blow. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was the first concrete proof that my wife was keeping something that came from a long time ago, something she wasn't ready to face or share. As I stared at the paper tucked under the shelf, a strange feeling washed over me. It was as if the entire garage held its breath along with me. The atmosphere, previously just cold and empty, now seemed alive, alert, almost vigilant, as if that letter, because I knew deep down it was a letter, was the gravitational center of all the pain she had been carrying for the past few weeks. The suspense that built up at that moment was almost tangible. The audience watching that scene on video would feel the same thing, that delicious and agonizing tension of knowing that something crucial is about to be revealed, but it's not yet the right time. The feeling of being one step away from the truth, but at the same time miles away from understanding its meaning. I picked up the paper carefully, feeling its rough, fragile texture under my fingers. The faint sound I'd heard before, that crackling, was nothing more than the corner of the sheet hitting the wood whenever the cold garage wind entered through a small crack in the outside door. That's what I'd heard. A simple, banal sound, but one that carried within it an entire story. A story I hadn't read before. A story that would probably change everything. I held the paper in my hand. My breath caught in my chest. My mind consumed by a confusion of fear, curiosity, and foreboding. I didn't open the letter at that moment. Something inside me told me I needed calm, that this wasn't just a forgotten object. It was a revelation, a crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain every tear of hers, every silence, every night in the garage. The suspense was officially established. I just didn't imagine how far this story would take me. When I finally managed to pull out that piece of paper stuck under the shelf, I realized it wasn't just a forgotten scrap of paper. It was a letter, a real letter, carefully folded, aged by time, like those you only see in old family boxes, kept at the bottom of a trunk that no one has opened for years. At that moment, something inside me changed. Until then, I had been dealing with suspicions. From that moment on, I was facing evidence. I held the letter with both hands, afraid of tearing it. The paper was thin, slightly rough, with a yellowish tint that betrayed its age. It wasn't ordinary paper. It didn't seem recent. It was the kind of texture that carries history, that carries time, that carries silences. As I turned the paper over to see better, my eyes went straight to the upper right corner, and it was there that the world around me seemed to stop. There was a date, written in pen, with a firm, old-fashioned, well-formed handwriting that almost no one has anymore today. A date from more than 2 decades ago, more than 20 years. Long before I met my wife, long before anything we did together existed. It was as if that piece of paper had been written in another life, in a time when I wasn't part of any of it. I read the date more than once, as if I might have misinterpreted it. Day, month, year. There was no mistake. That letter was connected to her story, to her life, to her childhood, and not to our life together. That in itself already carried an enormous weight, because it meant that the tears she shed in the garage every night weren't about something recent. They were about something old, too old. But it was when I turned the card over and saw what was written on the front that my hands really started shaking. In the center of the envelope, in the same firm, old-fashioned handwriting, was a phrase. A single phrase. Simple, but carrying a force I can't fully describe. A phrase that, as soon as I read it, made everything feel heavier. It was written, "For when she's finally ready." I read slowly, syllable by syllable, as if deciphering a code. For when she's finally ready. Ready for what? Ready to know what? Ready to remember whom? Ready to face which truth? At that moment, it was as if I felt the presence of two people with me in that garage, my wife and the person who wrote that letter. An invisible author, someone who knew a part of her story that I never knew, someone who knew that one day she would have to be ready for something, and that one day had arrived, because the letter wasn't in just any drawer. It wasn't in a box of memories, mixed in with old objects. It was stuck under a shelf, hidden away. Someone had decided to put it there. Someone had taken care to leave it in a specific place, difficult to notice, but not impossible to find. And, judging by the state of the paper, it was clear that it hadn't been touched many times in its life. But there was one detail that kept burning in my mind. If the letter had been written more than 20 years ago, and it was there, in our garage, then at some point, someone had brought it here. My wife knew of its existence, recently, and that explained everything. The nights, the crying, the silence, the distance, the vague answers. She wasn't just sad. She was processing something from the past, something that was delivered to her in a way I still didn't understand. I held the envelope tighter, feeling the symbolic weight of those words. For when she's finally ready, it felt like I had interrupted her internal process, as if I had barged into a room where she was still organizing her own memories, trying to decide what to do with it all. It was as if that letter were an old mirror, and she was facing her most vulnerable version, and I, having found it first, was about to see the reflection along with her. For a few moments I hesitated to open it, not for lack of courage, but out of respect. This letter didn't have my name on it. It wasn't for us, it wasn't for me, it was for her, and there was no denying that. At the same time, the whole context screamed at me. She had found this letter. She came there every night to cry. She hadn't told me anything. She was clearly trying to be too strong while falling apart alone. It was as if the universe had placed that letter in my hands at, that exact moment, so that I would stop guessing and start understanding, so that I would have the chance to truly help her, and not just watch from a distance as she sank into something she couldn't share. As I stared at the phrase on the front of the envelope, my mind began to conjure up scenarios. Who could have written it? A relative? A friend? A past love? An enemy? Someone who hurt her? Someone who tried to protect her? The passage of time, those 2 decades, made everything even more profound, because anything that survives so long unread, unresolved, is not insignificant. It's something big, something that left a mark, something that captured a piece of someone's history. The emotional camera of this scene, if it were filmed, would focus on my trembling hands, on the close-up of the date, on the close-up of the phrase, on my heavy breathing. The sound of silence would almost be a character in its own right. The audience would feel this weight, this delay between the moment. The letter was written and the moment it would finally be read. It's as if time itself were holding the envelope along with me. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of guilt and need. Guilt for being about to cross a border that might not even be mine. Need for knowing that if I backed down, she would remain alone. And she had already been alone in this pain for far too long. I ran my finger over the phrase again. For when she's finally ready, and for the first time, I thought of something that completely changed the course of my decision. Perhaps she would never feel ready on her own. Perhaps that letter had been written for the moment when someone beside her would also be ready to hold that truth together with her. And there, with the letter in my hands, the date fading into the corner of the paper and that phrase echoing in my mind, I knew I would go all the way. I would discover what was inside, not out of empty curiosity, not out of intrusion, but out of love. Because loving someone also means being willing to open old letters, face ghosts of the past, and hold their hand even when what comes out of the envelope isn't pretty, easy, or light. I simply had no idea that by opening that letter, I wouldn't just be learning about her past. I would, in a way, be giving new meaning to our future. And it was there, with the aged envelope between my fingers and my heart pounding in my chest, that I understood. The truth had found me. Now I needed to decide what I would do with it. When I finally mustered the courage to open the envelope, my hands trembled uncontrollably. It felt like I was about to walk through a door that would never close again, and that, upon passing through it, nothing would ever be the same. The paper, already fragile from age, opened with a soft sound, almost an ancient sigh, as if awakening after decades of silence. And then, before me, was the handwriting that would change everything. The first paragraph began with a name I recognized immediately, my wife's father's name. A man who, according to her, had disappeared when she was only 6 years old. A man whom, throughout our relationship, she described in a neutral, almost distant tone, as if speaking of a forgotten shadow in her memory. She always said that he had left without explanation, that he had never returned, that he never sent letters, messages, nothing. In her narrative, he simply disappeared, like a ghost that one day decides to stop haunting. But that's not what the letter said. Right on the first line, like a direct and unannounced blow, it was written, "My dear daughter, if you are reading this, it means the day has come, the day when the truth finally finds you." The word true, it seemed to leap off the page, and as I continued reading, the impact was even greater. There, right at the beginning, he said something that completely shattered everything she had believed her entire life. He hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't run away. He hadn't disappeared, just as she had always said and believed. Her father explained, with pain overflowing between the lines, that it wasn't he who distanced himself. He was distanced, forced, prevented, manipulated. There were details that, in that first paragraph, already changed the entire perspective. Mentions of a contentious separation, court decisions he disagreed with, accusations he couldn't prove false, doors slammed in his face while he tried to fight for custody. And the hardest part, he said he spent years trying to see his daughter, but was blocked in every way. The phrase that hit me hardest at that moment was a simple, yet devastating one. "I never left you. I was ripped from your life." When I read that, I felt breathless. My body froze. The realization hit me like an electric shock. My wife had built her whole life believing her father had abandoned her, when in reality he fought and lost for the chance to stay by her side. It was as if I were watching a castle crumble, stone by stone, in my head, imagining what that would mean for her. And this is where the audience feels the emotional impact. The idea that something fundamental to a person's identity, their origin, their history, their relationship with their parents, was built upon an incomplete, distorted, or even completely false version. The audience feels this because almost everyone has some childhood memory that, seen through adult eyes, takes on a different meaning. But in her case, it was even deeper. It was the entire foundation of a pain. As I read, I realized that her father wasn't writing with resentment. That was perhaps what surprised me most. He wrote with sadness, with love, with resignation, but not with hatred. He said he understood that her mother had made difficult decisions, but that he disagreed with all of them. He spoke of the truth that could never be told, of the story she grew up believing, and of how he always hoped that one day she would know what really happened. And then came the hardest part of all. I left this letter because I may never have the chance to explain it to you in person. It was while reading that line that I felt my throat tighten. It was as if I were witnessing a conversation that never happened, but that should have. A conversation that could have changed the way my wife saw her own life, her own worth, her own abandonment. I continued reading the paragraph, and each sentence seemed to carry decades of silence and longing. He said that, for years, he had written other letters that were never delivered, that he had tried to get closer, but was refused, that he had wished, countless times, to appear at her school gate, but knew he would be forcibly removed, that he imagined how she would grow up, how she would speak, what her smile would be like, and that, above all, he never stopped being a father, even without being able to fulfill that role. The revelation was brutal. The entire narrative she had carried since childhood crumbled on that fragile piece of paper. And at that moment, I understood why she cried every night in the garage. I understood why she went downstairs alone, in silence, to face that letter. I understood why she avoided talking to me, why she said it was all in her head. She was facing the ruin of a truth that was never true. She was facing a father who hadn't abandoned her, but had been prevented from loving her. And more than that, I was facing a mother who perhaps hadn't told the whole story. I felt the impact of it all as if it were happening to me, because upon reading that first paragraph, I realized it wasn't just a letter. It was a cry trapped for decades. It was a plea for forgiveness that never reached her. It was a father trying for the last time to be a part of the life of a daughter who grew up believing she was unwanted by him. And I knew that when I showed her this, her whole world would change. It wasn't just a story from the past. It was an emotional earthquake that was still unfolding. As I moved into the second and third paragraphs of the letter, I felt as if I were trespassing on such fragile and intimate territory that any stronger breath could destroy something. Each sentence seemed written with the tip of the heart, not just with a pen. It was impossible to continue reading without feeling the weight of decades of silence, frustration, suppressed love, and accumulated pain. And the more I read, the more I understood that there was a much bigger story there than the simple disappearance of a father. It was, in fact, a family conflict so profound that it had shaped my wife's life since childhood, and continued to shape her nights, her fears, her silence. Her father began by explaining, why did he have to leave her? And that phrase already carried a brutal meaning, because it completely dismantled the simplistic narrative she had heard her whole life. He disappeared. No, he didn't disappear. He was forced to leave. He was removed. By court decisions he didn't control. By accusations he never managed to adequately defend himself against. By conflicts he described as an emotional battlefield between him and her mother. He wrote in detail about the separation, not as someone trying to blame, but as someone who finally has the chance to tell his own side of the story. He said that her mother, for reasons that mixed fear, anger, and unresolved traumas from her own past, believed that distancing herself from him was the only way to protect her daughter. He spoke of arguments that started small and grew like an uncontrolled wildfire. He mentioned episodes of jealousy, distrust, old resentments, deep insecurities, all coming together like pieces of a tragic puzzle. It wasn't just a lover's quarrel. It was an emotional war, a war whose main wound was the child they had together. He revealed details I would never have imagined. He said he tried to fight for joint custody, but each attempt turned into a legal nightmare. He described how her mother prevented visits, returned gifts unopened, and destroyed letters before they reached her daughter. He wrote, "I saw you at the school gate from afar, unable to get closer. I saw your hair, the way you walked, but I couldn't enter your world." That sentence pierced me like a blade. There was no hatred there, only a love crushed by helplessness. And then came the hardest part, the trauma. He recounted that her mother had grown up in an unstable environment, marked by an aggressive and unpredictable father. He harbored a deep fear of repeating that history in raising his daughter, and although he vehemently denied any similar behavior, he acknowledged that in their arguments, his ex-partner relived her own past, and consumed by this terror that predated even her meeting him, transformed him into the villain she feared encountering again. It was an old pain being projected onto another person. It was a trauma that was multiplying. Ultimately, she was a woman fighting against ghosts that no longer had faces. And he, even though innocent, ended up becoming a victim of these ghosts. He wrote about it with a compassion that surprised me. Your mother loved you. She was just afraid of repeating the pain she once suffered. And in an attempt to protect you from that ghost, she ended up pushing you away from me, without realizing she was creating another kind of pain. There, in that passage, I realized something that completely changed everything. There were no clear villains in that story. There were no monsters. There wasn't a lie built out of malice. Instead, there was something much more complex. Two injured people trying to protect their daughter and at the same time destroying their own chance of creating a united family. Her father explained that he had tried to return countless times. He tried agreements. He tried mediation. He tried conversations. He tried to apologize even for things he hadn't done, all to at least see her grow up. But nothing worked. Each attempt generated more conflict, and as the years passed, the distance grew. And when she got older, it no longer made sense to try to get closer directly. She already carried the version of the story she had heard since she was little. And it was here that a crucial detail emerged. Daughter, I left this letter hoping that one day you might know that it was never your fault, and that you were never unwanted. The word unwanted, it shone like an open wound. I knew that my wife had always carried a sadness that sometimes appeared out of nowhere, a silent insecurity, a feeling that she needed to be perfect to be loved. It was as if she were afraid of being abandoned again. Now I understood. She grew up believing that her father had chosen to leave, that she hadn't been enough to make him stay, and that unintentional lie shaped his life. As I read, I could imagine my wife discovering all of this alone in the darkness of the garage. I could imagine her confronting memories buried for decades, revisiting scenes from her childhood that now had completely different meanings. Her crying wasn't just sadness. It was reconciliation with a wounded child she had never been able to comfort. It was a confrontation. It was liberation. It was painful, but also a revelation. Each paragraph showed that she wasn't just rereading her father's story. She was reliving her own, perhaps for the first time, truthfully. Harsh truth. Truth that rebuilds, but first destroys. And at that moment I understood something that completely changed the way I looked at my wife. She wasn't just crying. She was rediscovering herself. And nobody goes through this without breaking a little along the way. As I progressed towards the end of the letter, my hands remained trembling, but it was no longer just from the shock of the revelations. It was because of the emotional weight each sentence carried, because of the feeling that I was witnessing something that was never meant for me, but that, in a way, needed to pass through my hands so that it could finally complete its journey. The letter, up to that point, had already shown me family secrets, old pains, and truths that had been buried for more than 2 decades. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the final lines. My wife's father ended his message with such brutal honesty that it seemed to pierce the paper. It was as if he knew at the moment he wrote that this would be the last possible contact with his daughter, as if he were aware that time was short, that the chances were slim, and that this letter was his only way to leave a final, true human mark. The last sentences said, "If you are reading this, please forgive me. You deserve to know the truth. I never stopped loving you." There was something definitive there. Something that paralyzed the heart. It wasn't just a request. It was an emotional legacy. It was the last thread connecting a father to his daughter. And it was, at the same time, the confession of a lifetime marked by involuntary absence, regrets, and stifled love. When I read the phrase, "forgive me," I felt a deep lump in my throat, because that word, forgiveness, had never been part of my wife's narrative about her father. For her, he was simply someone who chose to leave, someone who never wanted to be a father, someone who gave up on her. And now, before me, I was reading a man begging to be forgiven for a guilt he didn't carry alone. A man apologizing not for voluntary abandonment, but for not having been able to fight against forces greater than himself. And the phrase, "You deserve to know the truth," was like a silent blow, because she never needed to deserve anything. She always deserved the truth, like every child, like every person. But for some reason, life decided that she would grow up amidst distorted versions of the facts, protected and at the same time wounded by an incomplete story. But it was the last sentence that made my heart stop. I never stopped loving you. This phrase is not just a statement. It's a liberation, a belated healing, an embrace that never happened, a reunion that came 20 years too late. It was the confession of a father who loved silently for decades and who, finally, found a way to shout out that love, albeit from the depths of a memory. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to process the impact of those words. My mind wandered. I imagined my wife reading it for the first time, alone, in the dark, sitting in that chair dragged to the corner of the garage, holding a piece of paper that demolished everything she had believed since childhood. She must have felt an impossible mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness, shock, longing for someone she never truly got to know. And it was there, in the middle of the silent garage, that a profound understanding struck me. She didn't tell me anything because she was trying to survive the truth. It wasn't a lack of trust. It wasn't distance caused by me. It wasn't rejection, nor coldness, nor neglect. It was pain, old pain, raw pain, pain that was resurfacing after years of slumber. She didn't know how to talk about it because she didn't even understand it yet. She didn't know where to begin. She wasn't prepared to put into words the impact of discovering that the greatest abandonment of her life never happened the way she imagined. Even worse, realizing that someone may have shaped this flawed narrative to protect her. It's impossible to put into words the complexity of this kind of revelation. The human mind doesn't cope well with ruptures of this magnitude. It's as if suddenly the entire past needed to be revisited, all memories adjusted, all feelings reorganized. My wife was reliving her childhood with new eyes, reconstructing memories that were once simple and were now full of hidden meanings. She was, literally, rewriting her own story, alone, and it hit me with a force that made my chest clench. I finally understood the reason for the silent tears, the reason for the distance, the reason for the short answers. She didn't want to hurt me. She was trying not to break into 1,000 pieces in front of me. She was trying to be too strong, and nobody can be that strong for that long. The end of the letter also revealed a gesture of love that deeply touched me. He wrote that even knowing it might never be read, he hoped that one day, somehow, the letter would find its way to her. He hoped the truth would reach his daughter's heart. He hoped that even if he were no longer alive, his words could serve as a belated embrace. I took a deep breath and carefully closed the letter, as if I were holding not just a piece of paper, but the souls of two people, the soul of a father who tried, and the soul of a daughter who unknowingly had always waited for this explanation. There, standing in the garage, I felt the weight of the responsibility I now carried. I knew I needed to be her safe haven. I knew that when she was ready to speak, I should listen to every word, comfort every tear, hold on to every piece of that truth. Because even if she was trying to face this alone, this burden shouldn't be carried by just one person. And as I put the letter back in the envelope, I understood something even deeper. My wife wasn't just crying for the father she lost. She was crying over the life she could have had, for the child who believed she had been abandoned, for the woman who grew up with a silent hole in her chest, and because the truth arrived too late. After finishing reading the letter, after feeling those words pierce my chest like silent arrows, I stood in the middle of the garage for long minutes, completely still. It was as if I were suspended between two worlds, the world we believed we lived in until now, and the world that letter had just revealed. The air seemed thicker, almost impossible to breathe. The shadows on the walls seemed to watch me as if even they knew I was facing a decision that would change everything. Holding the envelope between my fingers, I felt its symbolic weight. It wasn't just an old piece of paper. It was a secret that didn't belong to me, but that suddenly was in my hands. And at that moment, perhaps for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of hurting the person I loved most, not with my actions, but with the truth. And the question that began to echo inside me, insistent, almost painful, was, what do I do now? Card monster? Or should I pretend I never found anything? None of the options were simple. None of the options came without consequences. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that any choice carried inevitable pain. If I showed her the letter immediately, it might seem like I was invading something too intimate, that I was crossing a line, that I was touching on a wound she was barely beginning to understand. She might feel exposed, vulnerable, guilty for not telling me sooner, pressured to explain something she hadn't even processed herself. And I didn't want her to feel cornered. I didn't want that revelation, so profound and so painful, to feel forced. But if I pretended that nothing had happened, that which I have not seen, have not read, have not touched, if I simply kept everything inside me, so I would be leaving the woman I love to face this storm alone, and that, however silent it might be, would be a form of abandonment. I couldn't bear to be another shadow in her life. It was as if I were at an emotional crossroads, caught between the duty to respect her privacy and the duty to support her. And in that instant, I realized something that made everything inside me tremble. Any decision involving that letter wasn't just about her past. It was about our future. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. As I climbed back up the stairs with the envelope in my hand, I felt the emotions building, as if each step were an invitation to deeper reflection. The house was silent. That tense silence. That silence that carries invisible questions. That silence that echoes our own fears. When I got to the living room, she wasn't there. The kitchen light was off, and the living room curtains moved slightly because of the breeze coming from the backyard. It was too calm a scene for the chaos I carried inside me. I went to the hallway and heard the bedroom door close slowly. She was there. And I knew in that instant that I needed to make a decision. Right then. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let this truth fester inside us. At the same time, I couldn't come in aggressively, brandishing the letter as if presenting proof, as if saying, I've discovered your secret. No, that would be cruel. She didn't need a confrontation. She needed care. And that's when the emotional dilemma reached its peak. The audience watching this on video would feel the same. The weight of choosing between hurting and helping, between remaining silent and speaking, between protecting and risking. This moment is universal. Everyone has experienced a situation where they didn't know how to approach someone who is suffering. The feeling of walking on broken glass is always the same. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, staring at the closed door. I imagined what she might be thinking, how she might be feeling, and I understood that even without saying anything, she was asking for help. The hidden tears, the long silences, the flimsy apologies, all of this was the silent cry of someone who didn't know how to deal with their own pain. And that's when I knew what I needed to do. It wasn't about confronting her. It wasn't about hiding the letter. It was about talking to her, calmly, lovingly, and with presence. These 3 words became my anchors. I knocked lightly on the door. Honey, can I come in? Her voice, muffled, replied, You can. I entered slowly. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, arms crossed, looking at the floor. Her red eyes betrayed that she had cried again. And when she looked up at me, I realized it wasn't the time to speak directly. It was the time to show her that I was there, really there, and that she didn't need to hide anything anymore. I sat down next to her without touching the envelope yet. I wanted her to feel me before she felt the weight of the letter. I need to talk to you, I said softly, in the gentlest voice I could manage. But don't be scared. I just want to understand you. She took a deep breath, as if she were about to collapse again. That's when I held her hand, and I felt it. Her hand was trembling. The same trembling I had felt when I read the letter. It was as if our fears were conversing even before the two of us spoke. I didn't say, "I found the letter," right away. I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask for explanations. I started with what really mattered. "You are not alone." She closed her eyes, and a tear escaped. In that instant, I understood that I had made the right decision, the most human decision, the most loving decision. And in that silent room, I knew there was still much to be revealed. Much remains to be healed. Much needs to be rebuilt. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were starting the journey together. When I told her she wasn't alone, something inside her broke. I saw it in her eyes, in the way her face suddenly crumbled, as if the walls she'd been trying to hold up for weeks had finally collapsed. She didn't try to pretend. She didn't force a smile. She didn't make up an excuse. Instead, she took a deep breath, like someone trying to hold back tears, and failed. She collapsed. The tears came all at once, uncontrollably, without elegance, without a filter. Heavy old tears, laden with everything she hadn't spoken for years. She brought her hands to her face, as if trying to hide her own vulnerability, as if still instinctively trying to protect others from her pain. But I wouldn't let her. I gently took her wrists and slowly lowered her hands so she could cry there, openly, in front of me, without having to hide anymore. She tried to begin, but her voice choked. "Everything's fine," I said. "You can talk. I'm here." This time she believed. It took her a few seconds to manage to get words between sobs. And when she finally spoke, it was as if she had opened a dam. "I found the letter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I found this letter weeks ago." My heart tightened. I already suspected it, but hearing it from her had a completely different weight. It was confirmation of everything. It was the key that activated the nights in the garage, the swollen eyes, the silence, the distance. "In the garage?" I asked carefully, trying not to sound like I already knew more than I should. She nodded. "I was looking for an old box," she continued. "A box with my mother's things. I wanted to find some old photos. I don't even know why. I just felt like it. And when I moved a shelf, I saw the envelope stuck underneath." She paused, wiped her face with the back of her hand, but the tears kept falling. "When I saw the date, I froze," she said. "It was more than 20 years ago, and the name, I recognized it instantly. I knew it was his, my father's. The way she said, 'about my father,' was different. There was no hatred, no coldness. There was confusion, pain, a specific kind of pain, the kind that only exists when a person has never had the chance to close a chapter of their own story. "I sat right there on the garage floor," she continued, "and I opened it. I read it. I read everything. And it was like someone had taken my entire childhood and turned it upside down." She told me, between sobs, that she had read the letter more than once that night, that on the first reading, she only cried. On the second, she felt anger. On the third, she remained silent, staring at the paper as if it were alive. And that, since that day, she returned to the garage almost every night to reread at least a passage. Not because she liked to suffer, but because she didn't know how to move on knowing that, and at the same time, she didn't know how to go back to living as if nothing had changed. "I didn't know what to do," she confessed. "I didn't know if I should tell you. I didn't know if I should talk to my mother. I didn't know if I should tear up the letter or keep it. I didn't even know who I was anymore." That sentence hurt, because it was true. When a person discovers that an essential part of their story has been told incompletely, they lose some certainty about themselves. My wife was trying to rediscover herself. It wasn't just about her father. It was about her. "I grew up believing he had abandoned me," she said, now looking directly into my eyes. "That I wasn't enough for him to stay. That I wasn't important enough. And now I find out that he tried, that he fought, that he loved me, from a distance. Without being able to do anything." She placed her hand on her chest, as if trying to hold a heart that weighed too much. "Do you have any idea what that's like?" she asked, but not aggressively. It was a cathartic outpouring. Spending your whole life thinking you've been rejected, and then suddenly realizing that maybe it was all a big misunderstanding, that the person you blamed in your head maybe never had a chance to defend themselves. I wanted to answer. I wanted to. say I understood. I wanted to say yes, that I could imagine, but that would be a lie. I didn't know, not to that extent. And at that moment, I realized that the most important thing wasn't saying I understood. It was showing that I was willing to try to understand with her, to walk alongside her, even if the path wasn't mine. I don't know what it's like, I replied honestly, but I want to be by your side while you find out. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing those words. Then, she took a deep breath. The crying began to subside, but the trembling in her body was still there. It was as if everything inside her was in the process of reorganizing itself. I didn't tell you before, she continued, not because I don't trust you. Don't think that. I didn't tell you because I simply couldn't speak. Every time I tried, it felt like I'd become a 6-year-old again, hearing that my father had left. That image broke me to pieces inside. I no longer saw just my adult wife, standing before me. I saw the child she once was, small, confused, holding onto a version of the story that hurt her without even having the emotional tools to understand why. And now, so many years later, that same child was finally trying to be heard. I thought if I pretended nothing had changed, it would be easier, she admitted. But it wasn't. Every time I went down to the garage and read it again, I felt like something inside me, she pointed to her chest, was asking to be healed. But I didn't know how to do it alone. That's when everything made sense. She wasn't running away from me. She was trying to avoid collapsing in front of me. She wasn't excluding me from the pain. She just didn't know how to include me without feeling even more vulnerable herself. I squeezed her hand tighter, pulling her a little closer, and this time, it was my eyes that filled with tears. You don't have to go through this alone anymore, I said. The letter isn't just about your pain. It's part of your story. And if it's part of your story, it's also part of mine, because I chose to live life with you. That sentence made something inside her change. I saw it. There was a kind of relief in her eyes, as if for the first time since finding that letter, she felt that the burden could be shared. She rested her head on my shoulder, not as someone simply seeking comfort, but as someone finally allowing herself to rest. At that moment, the room ceased to be merely a physical space and became a sacred place. There was nothing special about it. Ordinary walls, a half-made bed, soft lighting. But the scene was of indescribable depth. It was the scene of a woman finally letting someone into the place where she most feared being seen, and of a man willing to stay, even knowing that this territory was filled with pain that wasn't his own. The conversation continued. She told me details of her childhood, memories of her mother, phrases she had heard, questions that never made sense. I, on the other hand, told her what I felt upon finding the letter, how it hurt me to see her cry alone, how afraid I was of making a mistake by approaching her. And in this process of exchange, two things happened simultaneously. She began to feel less guilty about feeling the way she feels, and I began to understand more deeply who the woman I married really was. The pain didn't disappear. It wasn't a magic conversation that erased decades of emotional scars. But something essential was built. There, a bridge between her past and our present, between the wounded girl and the adult woman, between the truth that hurts and the love that embraces. When, at last, the crying gave way to silence, it was no longer the heavy silence of the last few weeks. It was a different kind of silence, the silence of someone who still feels pain, but no longer feels loneliness. She held my hand tightly and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me alone in this." And at that moment, I was certain the letter had changed her life. But the conversation changed our marriage. Because sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't happen when the truth comes to light, but when someone decides to stay by your side while you learn to live with them. After that transformative conversation, the house gained a different kind of silence. Not the heavy silence, laden with suspicion and suffering, but a lighter silence, the kind that arises when an old wound finally finds space to breathe. In the days that followed, I noticed that my wife walked around the house differently. She wasn't okay, not yet, but she was more whole. As if, for the first time in many years, the truth had lifted the weight of carrying an emotional lie from her shoulders. And it was at that moment, observing how her face seemed more serene, even amidst the occasional tears, that a profound reflection began to take root within me. Sometimes, those we love carry pains we don't know about, pain that comes from stories we haven't heard, of memories that were never told to us, from chapters that happened before us. And no matter how much we love someone, we will never know everything that shaped that person. We will never fully understand every scar. We will never be able to decipher every silence. There are parts of the other person's soul that will remain invisible, not out of secrecy, but out of trauma, fear, habit, or survival. My wife was living proof that behind a seemingly stable smile, there can be a wounded child, suffocated by years of beliefs that were never questioned. A child who grew up believing that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't worthy, that she wasn't loved, when in reality it was exactly the opposite. And that made me think about the overwhelming power that truth has. Not a truth spoken brutally, but a truth kept for decades, written with tears, with regret, with love. A truth that doesn't shout, it whispers. A truth that patiently waits for the right moment to appear, even if that moment takes years, or even if it never happens face to face. The truth, however harsh it may be, can be the beginning of healing. And this is so real, so profound, that it almost hurts to admit. The letter wasn't just an old piece of paper found by chance. It was a bridge, a lost piece of my wife's history that finally found its way back to her. It was a reunion between past and present, between father and daughter, between pain and liberation, between abandonment and love. And like any healing process, it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a straight line. My wife was still going to have difficult days. She was still going to relive confusing memories, still try to understand her mother's decisions, still question what was true and what was fear. But now she was no longer alone in her own emotional labyrinth. Now there was light. And above all, there was companionship. I realized that love isn't just about being present during the good times. Loving someone deeply means being willing to walk through the shadows of their life, even when that path doesn't belong to you. It means being willing to listen to painful stories, to see tears that aren't yours, to hold wounds that weren't born on your hands. It means saying, "I'll stay," even when everything inside the person seemed to say, "I don't know how to go on." And somehow, this whole episode strengthened something between us, something that can't be bought, forced, or rushed. True intimacy. Not our physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy, the kind that is born when two people meet exactly where they are most afraid to be seen. I realized that, even after years together, there were still parts of her story that I didn't know. And now, he had the privilege and the responsibility of walking beside her as she stitched together pieces of a memory that had always been incomplete. And in the end, I understood that the hidden letter wasn't just about her father. It was about forgiveness, about understanding, about liberation. It was about breaking a cycle of silence that had spanned generations. It was about allowing the truth, even when it hurts, to make room for love to grow. The night I found the letter in the garage seemed distant now. That moment, frozen in time, her perfume, the soft rustling under the shelf, the aged envelope, had transformed into something far greater than I could have imagined that first night. The garage, once a cold and silent setting, had become a symbolic place, the spot where the past finally found a chance to be understood. And I realized something even more powerful. Healing is not about erasing the pain. Healing is about naming the pain. It's about understanding where it came from. It's about allowing it to finally breathe. When I sat next to her during that first conversation, I wasn't offering answers. I was offering my presence. And sometimes, that's all someone needs to begin to rebuild themselves. Now, with the letter kept in a safe place, with the past exposed to the light, with real love occupying the space where before there was only fear, I realized that that chapter of our lives didn't close a cycle, it opened a new one. And if someone were to ask me one day what I learned from all this, I would say, the truth can hurt, but silence hurts much more. Love may not heal everything, but it's impossible to begin the cure without it. And above all, no one should have to carry alone the pain that began when they were just a child. The truth found my wife too late for a father's embrace, but early enough for her to finally break free from the shadow of an abandonment that never happened. And in the end, that's a kind of miracle, too. If this story touched you in any way, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring you more exciting stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, would you have the courage to open the letter, or would you leave it where it was?